Good morning, and thank you very much for that introduction, and also thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here and among such illustrious company. So this morning I wanted to talk to you all about one challenge facing democracy in America in particular. This challenge has to do with the meaning and practice of this concept we call freedom of speech. It's a topic we hear and talk about a lot in the academy and also beyond. But it's one where we don't really often feel that we're making much progress, or indeed that we're even talking about the same thing. And it's that sort of suspicion that we may well not be talking about the same thing, which is one of the things I want to explore with you all this morning. But it remains the case that for Americans, few freedoms seem more obvious or ours than the freedom of speech. Certainly none distinguishes us so starkly from our European counterparts, and I'll just say now as an American living and teaching abroad, first in Canada and now in the UK, I can confirm that the primacy and permissiveness of the American commitment to free speech is truly exceptional. Until recently, it seemed that let all else descend into the maelstrom of partisanship and polarization, Democrats and Republicans could at least agree that the way to adjudicate our differences was through the free, if not always fair, exchange of insults, as well as of ideas. But lately, it seems that the freedom of speech, like all else, has become a topic of partisan controversy. The American commentariat continues to spill rivers of ink on trying to understand why it seems so embattled on college campuses in particular, and as well as to understand the kind of shifting partisan and ideological and also generational alignments that account for the change. I mean, to put the matter explicitly, for those who remember the original campus free speech movement of the 1960s, its spectacular shift from left to right, with self-identified liberals now calling for and even sometimes engaging in increasingly disruptive efforts to shut down or no platform controversial speakers, and then on the other hand, increasingly rambunctious and occasionally offensive right-wing provocateurs, right? This is the shift. It's a source of some confusion and chagrin for those who remember what this looked like in the late 60s. But in any case, debates about free speech on campus or online tend to focus, as American debates so often do, on the First Amendment. For those worried about creeping illiberalism among millennials, and I think I should just sort of own up to the fact right now that I am a millennial. So I have some experience of this. The temptation to retreat to the ostensibly neutral ground of the Constitution and to think that what kids these days really need is a remedial civics lesson, it's understandable, perhaps, but I don't think it's entirely adequate, for reasons that the kids are actually pretty good at pointing out. So the fact is that the cases we care about most are often those where the Constitution simply doesn't apply. Not only are social media mobs calling for someone to be censured or fired, comprised of individuals exercising their own rights to speak freely, but more concretely, private entities like Facebook or Twitter, or indeed Yale or Middlebury College, have the right to regulate and even exclude members on the basis of speech as they see fit. So to plead for tolerance of controversial or unpopular speech on First Amendment grounds in such cases is not a knockdown argument, it's simply a non sequitur. And of course, even the patron saint of political liberalism, none other than John Stuart Mill, and in this case, he was, as in many cases, he was just plagiarizing Tocqueville, knew quite well that the chief threat to free speech in democracies was not the government, but rather the quote-unquote social tyranny of one's fellow citizens. But again, I think that few student protesters or their defenders of no platforming among the commentariat are going to disagree with that. In fact, many would insist that they are not anti-free speech at all, that they, like Mill, are simply worried not just about the harms that hateful speech can do to individuals, but more particularly, they're worried about the silencing effects of certain kinds of hateful speech in creating a hostile democratic environment for speech that makes free speech impossible. So on this view, right? Shutting down hate speech and denying historically privileged voices a platform is necessary, the argument goes, not only to protect the vulnerable, but to make the equal right to free speech effective, so that the most marginalized and precarious members of our society can speak up to and finally be heard. Right? So this kind of intuition, right? I think this is an intuition that's been developed quite in sophisticated ways by feminist philosophers and legal theorists, Catherine MacKinnon or Ray Langton, through the lens of J.L. Austin's theory of speech acts. So the argument goes that certain utterances have what we call a perlocutionary effect. They act by bringing about certain effects in the world. So in this case, hate speech or sexist speech or pornography actually acts to silence, to exclude, to demean or suppress others in such ways that their speech then is impossible or ineffective, right? And so on that argument, and I think this is the argument being made, silencing that kind of speech, silencing speech that we call silencing speech, is itself justified on free speech grounds. Okay, so here, one might be tempted to respond to this Austinian line with another line from Isaiah Berlin's seminal 1958 essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Quote, "Liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness. If I lose my freedom in order to lessen the inequality of another, an absolute loss of liberty occurs." But I think that would be too quick, because I think as Berlin himself might have recognized, if he had heard my argument, he would recognize that, in fact, partly what's going on in contemporary controversies is a much older conflict between two different concepts of the freedom of speech. And both of these concepts are really as old as democracy itself. So the first is what the Greeks would have called Isegoria, on the one hand, and Parrhesia, on the other. Both are often translated into English today as freedom of speech, but their meanings were and are importantly distinct. So in ancient Athens, Isegoria described the equal right of citizens to participate in public debate in the democratic assembly or ecclesia, while Parrhesia meant an informal or private license to say what one pleased, how one pleased, and to whom. Right? And I think that these ancient ideas have come to shape our modern liberal democratic notions and debates in fascinating and forgotten ways. And so right now, I just want to trace for you their origins before I kind of come back to what they might have to tell us about our contemporary conundrum. Just the basic point is to see that there are two concepts, and to see that these two concepts are not simply in tension, but very often an outright conflict, I think can help explain that feeling of, that we're talking past each other about the very things that matter most. All right. So I would hardly be unique in tracing the origins of America's tradition of free speech fundamentalism to ancient Athens. As many of you no doubt know, the First Amendment as we know it today wasn't a product of the 18th century. It was a product of a series of influential Supreme Court decisions in the early 20th century, and more particularly of some supremely influential Supreme Court justices, so Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And for Brandeis especially, the thought that freedom of speech was the sine qua non of democracy was informed by his fascination with Athenian democracy. Apparently, he was really obnoxious and constantly haranguing his family and friends that they had to go read Alfred Zimmerman's book, The Greek Commonwealth. But in any case, but even so too, John Stuart Mill, as an early liberal, they had this sense that Socrates was the first martyr for free speech, right? And you see that argument in Mill's On Liberty. But neither Mill nor his American inheritors seem to have noticed that when it came to free speech in Athens, there were two very different concepts in play. So the first, Isegoria, that's the older one. So the term dates back to the 5th century BCE, although historians disagree about when the democratic practice of permitting any citizen who wanted to address the assembly actually began. But so despite the common translation freedom of speech, the Greek literally means something more like equal speech in public, right? The verb agorein, it's the idea of a public place, of the agora, right? A sort of a public assembly in which people are addressing one another. And of course, one of these people historically would have been Socrates. They're coming together to talk. So in the democracy of Athens, the idea of addressing an informal gathering in the agora carried over into the more formal setting of the ecclesia, or assembly. The herald would ask who will address the assemblyman, and then the volunteer would ascend the bema, or speaker's platform. And in theory, Isegoria meant that any Athenian citizen in good standing had the right to participate in debate and try to persuade his fellow citizens. But in practice, the participants were generally pretty limited. They were limited to the practiced rhetoricians and elder statesmen sitting in the front, and you could also be disqualified from your rights to Isegoria if you were convicted of taking bribes or prostitution. In any case, Athens was not the only democracy in the ancient world. We sometimes tend to forget this. But from the beginning, its principle of Isegoria was seen as something special. And you get indications of this in the fact that Herodotus, for instance, describes the Athenian constitution not as demokratia, not as democracy. He describes the constitution as itself Isegoria, right? Which is a very interesting point. Demosthenes, a later orator, right? He would say that the Athenian constitution was based on speeches and arguments, politeia and logois, with that its citizen had chosen Isegoria as a way of life. But for critics, this was a bug as well as a feature, right? So the so-called old oligarch, this anonymous critic, he complained that in Athens, even slaves and foreigners enjoyed Isegoria. Hence, you could not beat them as you would elsewhere, because they had an equal right to speak up. But critics like the old oligarch were, of course, exaggerating for comic effect, but they also had a point. So the etymology of Isegoria suggests that it's fundamentally about equality, not freedom. And as such, it would become the hallmark of Athenian democracy, and that distinguished it from other democratic city-states. The idea was that even the poorest citizen in Athens had this right, and the polis tried to make that effective by introducing pay for attending the assembly. Right? So as a form of free speech, Isegoria is fundamentally, essentially political. Its competitor, Parrhesia, was more expansive. So here again, the common English translation, freedom of speech, can be deceptive. The Greek means something more like all saying, and it comes closer to the idea of speaking freely or frankly. And so Parrhesia thus implied a kind of openness, honesty, and the courage to tell the truth, even when it was offensive. So the practitioner of Parrhesia, or the Parrhesiastes, was quite literally a say-it-all, right? So like Isegoria, Parrhesia was seen as characteristically Athenian by its critics and defenders alike. So Euripides is constantly pointing to this as what Athenians enjoy that makes them free men and not slaves. But when Plato noted that there was more Parrhesia in Athens than anywhere else in Greece, he didn't mean it as a compliment, right? So in the Republic, when Socrates describes the democratic constitution ruled by freedom in Parrhesia, it's so anarchic that even the animals wander aimlessly in the streets. Right? Isocrates, also in his famous Areopagiticus, which would then later inspire John Milton, writes that the problem in Athens is that we've conflated Parrhesia, speaking freely, with equality itself, isonomia. Others, however, were more optimistic. So Demosthenes, again, says that Parrhesia is an essential quality of a statesman. But the true sort of paragons of Parrhesia in ancient Athens were, of course, the philosophers. Above all, Socrates, the self-styled lover of wisdom, who would confront his fellow citizens in the agora and tell them whatever hard truths they least liked to hear. And of course, in the paragon, then, the culmination of this tradition was his younger contemporary Diogenes, the so-called cynic, who famously lived in a barrel, masturbated in public, and told Alexander the Great to get out of his light. As he said, he was going to reveal to his fellow Greeks the arbitrariness of their customs, whether they liked it or not. And so the danger intrinsic to Parrhesia in its offensiveness, inevitable offensiveness to the powers that be, fascinated Michel Foucault, right, who made it the subject of a series of lectures in Berkeley, the home of the original campus free speech movement in the 1980s. And so Foucault had noticed that the practice of Parrhesia necessarily entails inequality, between the speaker and the audience. This necessary asymmetry of power, and hence a kind of contract between the audience, whether they be one person, Alexander, or many people, the Democratic Assembly, who pledged to tolerate any offense that the speaker might cause, so long as he agreed to tell them the truth and risk the consequences, right? So if Isegoria is fundamentally about equality, then Parrhesia is fundamentally about liberty in the sense of license, not a right, but an unstable privilege that the weak enjoy at the pleasure of the powerful. In an Athenian democracy, that usually meant the majority of one's fellow citizens, who were known to shout down or even drag speakers, including Plato's own brother, Glaucon, off the bema or platform. That is the origin of no platforming, friends. Heckling speakers in the Athenian ecclesia. But of course, that kind of heckling, that kind of no platforming, could have deadly consequences, as the trial and death of Socrates, Plato's friend and teacher, attests. And so Plato was always very frustrated by both Isegoria and Parrhesia as they existed in Athens. And you might think that makes sense given how poorly his loved ones fared. Plato no doubt would have noticed that despite their differences, neither concept relied upon the most famous and distinctively Greek understanding of speech as logos, right? As reason or logical argument. So Plato's student, Aristotle, would later identify logos as the capacity that made human beings essentially political animals at all. And yet neither Isegoria nor Parrhesia identified the reasoned speech and arguments of logos as uniquely deserving of equal liberty or license, which seems to have been Plato's point. How was it that a democratic society that prided itself on free speech in all of its forms voted to put to death the one Athenian ruled by logos for speaking it, right? So, it's interesting to trace the legacy of these concepts as the democratic institutions in Athens that made them possible then disappeared. As you might expect, Parrhesia fared better than Isegoria did in the absence of democratic or public fora where people might enjoy an equal right. But of course, in the Bill of Rights in England in 1689, the quote-unquote freedom of speech and debates in Parliament was secured. But the idea was always that that right applied to members of that democratic forum only, not to just any Joe Schmo on the street. So the story of the 17th and 18th centuries, I would submit, is a story of the idea of Isegoria moving from the kind of concrete forum of the Democratic Assembly to the sort of speculative, abstract forum of this thing we know as the public sphere, right? And that idea that we have a freedom to speak, to philosophize, and as Kant would put it, to use our freedom to think in public, that becomes the really dominant European tradition. I would just note here, though, that that was not the dominant tradition in the early colonies of North America. In fact, I would argue, and I argue in my book that Jack so kindly mentioned, that in fact, what Americans get is this tradition of Parrhesia as refracted through the commitments of early evangelical Christians, including Quakers, who embodied the kind of a cynical understanding of speaking truth to power in ways that would have made even Diogenes blush. But in any event, so if you want to understand the American exceptionalism when it comes to free speech, just remember that we got the evangelicals and Europe kept the philosophers. But in any case, how can we think about this then and coming back to our challenges today? Well, I would simply say that what we see in contemporary controversy about free speech today is a classic conflict between an idea of freedom of speech as Isegoria, fundamentally about equality and the right of equal public speech, and Parrhesia as a speaking truth to power that is often offensive on the other. And I think that the argument I would make is that we need to understand these concepts and understand how they might be brought together, and indeed understand the First Amendment as an attempt to bring Parrhesiastic free speaking potentially offensive free speaking, together with a kind of institutional commitment and procedural commitment to the equality of speakers in the public sphere. And so that's the challenge I would like to sort of end with and give to you going forward. What kinds of institutions, and indeed what kinds of ethics, potentially virtues like civility, make it possible to reconcile these two different commitments? Because what I'll say is the view that it's just that kids these days don't get the First Amendment is unsatisfactory and unlikely to be persuasive. So thank you very much.
Don't go away.
Oh, sorry?
Stay up there.
Yes.
Teresa. So I think we have time
right.
for a couple questions, Annie.
That I could just run away.
Right. And the mics are available.
Hi, Bob Tarjan, Princeton.
Hi.
Do you have anything to say about corporations as free speakers as opposed to people?
I would say, as a historian of political thought, my move would be, well, let's look to how we might think about corporations as people at ground zero, which is, medieval Europe, and understanding the nature of these strange entities called colleges, of which I'm a member in Oxford. I mean, not to be glib, I think that's really right. I think that there's constantly this trouble of understanding what a person is, understanding who counts as a person, and what counts as a voice, right? And so I don't have any views that I would like to put on the table here on that question, only to say I think it's really a fundamental one. But again, I think these fundamental questions that seem to sort of pop up today and we feel, oh my goodness, these are unprecedented. I think they are rarely, if ever, unprecedented, and there's quite a lot to learn by reading the history of political thought in a kind of serious and imaginative way.
Hi, I'm Larry Tribe from Harvard. I'm
Hello.
fascinated by your take on this, and I'm wondering if you think, setting aside the question of personhood, from the perspective of the Supreme Court in cases like Citizens United, their answer to the proposition that artificial persons might not have the freedom of speech is that it's a binary freedom. It's a freedom also to hear and to listen. And I'm wondering whether you think that the embrace of a purely libertarian as opposed to egalitarian notion of speech is the core fallacy in a case like Citizens United. Not so much the insistence that corporations have the same rights as natural persons, but the insistence that in order that all ideas be heard and that all of us have an opportunity to hear whatever any entity has to say, that somehow one has to have no limits on the capacity of the loudest voice or the best funded voice.
Right.
So,
So right, again, I would not possibly pronounce on what was the core fallacy in any recent arguments or decisions, but I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I think has fallen out of debates about free speech in the public sphere, but also in the academy and in political theory, which is my field, is this sense of speech as not only a dyadic relation, but a triadic, or even the idea that when we speak, people listen to us, hopefully, but people also hear us beyond those to whom we're addressing ourselves. And understanding that part of the relationship, speech is an ongoing relationship that then has consequences for the kind of, not only for the semantic field, which might be the traditional Austinian concern, but also with the construction of the forum. I think that is really essential, and it's something that we're thinking about now increasingly in terms of technology and the way that platforms like Facebook and Twitter function. And I think there's a lot more thinking to do. However, I mean, the concern I would have, and here I would say that I'm a kind of non-evangelical Parrhesiastes myself, not to make it too complicated. Is I think that the insight that we never want the powers that happen to be in a position to decide who gets these supposedly equal rights. I mean, that fear, I think, is a healthy fear. It's one to keep in mind, but it also just points to the enormous power that these non-state actors have in making certain voices ring forth more loudly than others.
My colleague Nora has
Jean Taylor, NYU. There's the word truth in there, in speaking truth.
Yes.
Does one have freedom to promulgate whatever lies one wishes, and who decides truth? And
I think Foucault was with you.
what?
I think Foucault was with you on wondering who decides truth. I think that is the crux of the matter with Parrhesia, the idea that Diogenes isn't, helping himself in public simply because he thinks that's a kind of, fun thing to do. He thinks it's true. It's saying something true about the arbitrariness of the customs and societies in which we live. I think that America, this tradition of free speech fundamentalism is based on a kind of veneration of the Parrhesiastes as being a kind of prophet, as being a kind of provocateur who sort of challenges us in the name of truth. We give a lot of credit to his or her claim to be speaking truth or to have some kind of higher allegiance to truth. The concern then is, though, what happens when we seem to have good reasons to suspect that truth is not, in fact, the end. And it comes back, it comes back to this idea. My position is, I don't think that the idea that we could nominate a sort of bureau of truth is going to end in any, end otherwise than Orwell imagined it would. And so I think, again, coming back to this idea of encouraging individual speakers and listeners to see themselves as relating and in a relationship with their fellow citizens, in a relationship with their fellow people, I think we need to return and think better about the ethics of all this, how we participate online, how we treat our students, how we teach our students to comport themselves, and also to tell them that responses other than outrage to falsehood, to hatred, everything else, responses other than outrage are possible.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi. Great, fantastic talk.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I'm Jill Abramson. I spent my career at the Bureau of Truth, I thought. I was executive editor of the New York Times, and now I'm on the faculty of Harvard, where no platform runs as a strong current, regrettably. My question is about slander and whether we can look back to the Greeks and learn anything, because I hate to pollute this discussion with the name Donald Trump, but obviously slander is in the air in the headlines this morning, where news commentators are saying the president maybe slandered Stormy Daniels by suggesting she's crazy. Trump, in turn, has said the fake news media slanders him. What did the ancients make of slander and its role in free speech or not?
So interestingly, there are laws against slander in the ancient world. Oftentimes, the people you find complaining that there aren't enough. So Solon is remembered by, I think it is in Milton, in Areopagitica, saying, it's Erasmus, saying that Solon was very wise for calling for a law making it impossible to speak ill of the dead, so that enmities and fights would not continue beyond the grave, right? So we could actually put an end to our really rancorous disagreements. I don't know all that much about those laws in the ancient world, but in my book I talk a lot about what we might think of as early modern hate speech laws, which are religious insult statutes that are really inventive and in many ways creative attempts to put into practice the intuition that it's fine for me to say whatever I'd like about your devil-worshipping views, right? Or that you follow the papal antichrist. But something shifts if I call you yourself a devil or you yourself the antichrist. And so you find these attempts, including in this is my second favorite colony, Pennsylvania, but also in Carolina. And I think, but again, what you find is the limits of such legislative attempts to achieve their intended end, and what ends up happening time and again as religious dissenters end up getting prosecuted under precisely the laws that are meant to protect them. And so I loved the reference to Rhode Island earlier. I'm fascinated by what happened in Rhode Island, which is where none of these laws were enacted, and yet you do have this particularly pungent combination to which Jack alluded to earlier.
Well, having taught the first part of the American History Survey at Stanford for a long time, I'm a big believer in having a great leadoff hitter in the lineup, and I think Teresa has gotten us off to a wonderful start this morning. So.
Thank you.